Hello everybody, and thanks again for watching one of my videos on my ketogenic fasting project. That's the new name of it. In case you missed that, that's the name of my Facebook group. So I decided it made sense to have the same name for the videos or the podcast. So in this one, I'm going to talk about what's known as LCHF, or low carbohydrate, high fat. Um, in the previous video, talked about how um, ketogenic diet was related to primal diet, paleo diet, Whole 30, Wall's protocol, and a number of other low carbohydrate diets. I thought it was important to tie it into the concept of just LCHF. If you follow the news, you probably noticed that, like in Sweden, it's very popular, and they had kind of followed the same sort of nutritional guidelines we did here in the United States and other countries, only to find out that when they started eating more butter, as their consumption of butter doubled, their number of heart attacks was cut in half. And so in the context of a lot of news articles and sort of strategies of eating or ways of eating or ways of living, you'll see that low carbohydrate, high fat is one of those predominant concepts. So it really just kind of a strange way addresses the two of the three macronutrients that we talked about in previous videos. So it's just talking about carbohydrate and fat and kind of leaving protein out there in the wind, but the concept is basically pivoting on the idea that we were eating a high, or most people are still eating a high carbohydrate diet, and you need to replace that with something if you're going to cut back on carbohydrates. So you replace it with more fat, because you can only eat so much protein most of the time. Now, if you're an athlete, and you have an enormous capacity for calories that you're going to burn off quickly, it probably matters less. You can burn more carbohydrates, you can certainly burn more protein. If you're using your joints and your muscles a lot, you can definitely use more protein. So, but it's generally regarded as a bad idea to eat too much protein, especially if you're going to lose weight. It can inspire what's known as gluconeogenesis, meaning glucose that's made by your liver. And it's kind of up in the air, because if you're just getting started on a weight loss program, it's most likely going to interfere. It's going to make it harder to lose weight. It's going to keep your blood sugar higher. But if you are well along in your weight loss, you're keto adapted for a while, or you're an accomplished athlete, the extra protein doesn't seem to have that same effect. And of course, it doesn't have that same effect on every individual, period. That's one of the other things we touched on before about individualizing the diet and finding these things out. But it is typically one of the first mistakes and the most common mistakes that people make when it comes to starting a low fat diet, a low carb diet or a ketogenic diet, is they tend to eat too much protein and not enough fat. It's hard to get enough fat. You'll find out if you give it a try, though. So this also ties back to a question of what did our ancestors eat, because a lot of this, if just the term paleo, infers that we're talking about a diet that they ate in the Paleolithic era. Primal kind of hints at early people or prehistory. And so the question is, what did our ancestors eat? And we ask that question with the assumption that that's what we evolved to eat, and that's what we should be eating now for optimal health, right? So they're generally described as hunter-gatherers. So I know I talked to a lot of people. I had the same impression. Oh, they walked around and gathered plants and ate plants, berries and tubers and all that. But the truth is, when you go through the trash pile, there's an awful lot of bones in there. And if you're trying to find something to eat, would you rather eat some green leaves or would you rather eat some tasty animal? That's the thing. And would you rather steal some eggs out of a bird's nest? Maybe eat the bird too, or would you rather, scratch around and dig up some roots? Because keep in mind, there were no amber waves of grain. There were no carrots. Potatoes were tiny. Fruit was tiny. It was all seasonal. It was all regional. So there was only going to be select um, fruits in your area depending on the season. Um, there's going to be roots, but it didn't have all the nice big tubers that we have today. Like the big potatoes and sweet potatoes and yams. They're a lot smaller, and they didn't grow in abundance like they do in a planted farm. There weren't no fields of them. There was no orchards. Stuff just kind of grew randomly, and of course you're competing with all the animals for that stuff. So I think there's pretty good evidence, if anything, based on the success that I've had and other people are having eating more animal, that we probably ate fewer plants than we were led to believe. So the ketogenic diet is a low carb diet. Typically, you start about 5% of your daily calories, or 20 grams or less. Some people it might be a little higher, and that's typically just leafy greens. And you need it low like that, especially in the beginning, to get fat adapted or keto adapted. You give your body a chance of switching over from burning carbohydrates to burning fat. It's not an overnight process. Probably a short process for somebody who's just right for it is probably like a couple of weeks, and for somebody like myself, it's probably closer to 6 months. And then, of course, like I was saying earlier, you got to replace the carbohydrates with something. You don't want to eat too much protein, so you're going to eat more fat. So you're going to eat, maybe 70 to 85% of your calories from fat, and then roughly 10%. It could be 15 or 20%. But if you do that, you're not likely to get your blood sugar low enough. You're not likely to adapt to eating the fat if you don't really work at keeping that fat content up, especially in the beginning. And the way you know that is by testing your blood sugar and testing your blood ketones. So, low carbohydrate, high fat diet. The concept is nothing new. And this is one of the things that Gary Taubes pointed out. If you go back through the literature and you go back through what was written by doctors in the past, people understood this a long time ago, that if you ate a lot of carbohydrates, you usually wound up with diabetes. And there's pretty horrific descriptions of how people in ancient times suffered from it. And early doctors used to diagnose it by literally tasting urine. They could taste the excess sugar. So more on that. Definitely check out the books by Gary Taubes and Nina Teicholz. They just wrote a lot about this, and even though they're not really writing diet books, the information they provide and the description of the influence of our diet on mankind is really useful and helps shaping your thoughts about how to best look out for your own health through diet. So I talk a lot about the newer books, but the newer books talk a lot about the older books, right? So one of the better known um, early sort of Atkins style low carb diets was written by a guy named William Banting. He was a well-known undertaker, I believe, in England, and he was quite heavy, and his doctor said, hey, eat a bunch of meat, eat lots of meat and stuff, cut out the bread. And after failing at all kinds of other advice, that worked for him. So he wrote a letter. It was widely distributed, widely sold. It's probably the first actual dieting book. It was really more of a pamphlet. He got a lot of heat from the doctors. He said he didn't know what he was doing and he was going to kill people, even though this was a diet recommended by his doctor. And he published that in 1863, and he died much later at the age of 83, which is, you can imagine that's a good long life, especially before antibiotics, right? Um, let's see. I think I already covered that about tasting the sugar in the urine. So let's move on. So essentially, low carbohydrate, high fat, and ketogenic overlap to the point where one could be the same as the other. It really depends on who's talking about it. Most of us have heard of Atkins, Dr. Atkins' new diet revolution. It was first came out in the 70s. Um, and, I hear people all the time, I start the conversation about ketogenics. They're like, oh, I do Atkins when I want to lose weight and it works great. But they don't stay on it. So then they gain the weight back and then they go back on Atkins and lose it again. Which, hey, I personally would like to avoid yo-yo dieting because that's all that happened when I was a kid. I'd go on these crazy diets people would put me on and I'd be miserable. I'd lose weight and then I'd go off these diets and a lot of them weren't sustainable. And you're a kid. I was eating what what my parents bought for me to eat. So the other thing I hear about the Atkins diet is that he wasn't on it, he was fat and it killed him. Well, none of that was true. He was on the diet from the 70s until 2003, and the reason why he died is because he slipped on the ice in New York City, hit his head, died of a brain injury, and they did look in his arteries and they were not clogged at the ripe old age of 73. So it was said to be about 6 foot tall and about 200 pounds, so perhaps not a real lean man, but nonetheless, 6 foot 200 pounds, that's probably a little lighter than average these days anyways. So that's kind of the story of Dr. Atkins. I recently listened to that book again, and it's very much sort of a ketogenic book. He talks more about lipolysis, which is the body releasing the fat from the fat cells as opposed to being in a state of ketosis. He does mention ketosis, but he doesn't really talk about ketogenic diets. But it's very similar. I think one of the biggest differences at the time, people thought about diets as just something you did for a short period of time, mostly because you hated it, and then you went off of it, whereas now we tend to think of these things more of a lifestyle or a way of eating for the rest of your life. So as much as there's nothing new under the sun, a lot of the new data that we find out from the research that's going on and the success people are having, we also we know more about it. We have a more intimate understanding of how it works and how to leverage it for our own good. So, but definitely a good read. Pick it up. I'm sure there's millions and millions of copies out there. So, and it's available from Audible. So the low carbohydrate, high fat or ketogenic diet, what has it been used for? Well, since probably the early 1900s, it's been used to control seizures, primarily for epileptics, because back then they didn't have anti-seizure medications. So the diet was it, and a lot of what inspired people to start using it after that was the side effects that were known, like weight loss and mood stability and reduction in autoimmune diseases and stuff. So that kind of kept it on the back burner. Some people were still using it, even though it wasn't mainstream until recently. It's also being used for schizophrenia. It seems like when you drastically reduce the carbohydrates that you give schizophrenic, a lot of them respond positively and have a lot fewer symptoms. So there's a lot of research going into that angle right now. Of course, I've talked about type 2 diabetes. Because this is a low carbohydrate diet, your blood sugar goes down. It's that simple. So, in cancer, I talked about the Warburg effect in previous podcasts or videos. The Warburg effect is the effect where the lowering of the availability of blood sugar causes cancer cells to starve and sort of poison themselves. And there's several good books on the subject, one being Tripping Over the Truth. And the other two I haven't read because I haven't listened to because they're not available in audiobook form, but they're out there and they are widely read. So if you have any cancer concerns, I definitely would look into that. And then there's heart disease. Because ketogenic low carbohydrate type diets are anti-inflammatory, they tend to help prevent the blockage of the coronary arteries. In the same way, inflammation causes arthritis and a number of other diseases. This diet would have the opposite effect. It causes less inflammation. And without the inflammation in, say, the coronary arteries, the plaque doesn't accumulate there. Not as much is known about how the plaque is removed naturally by the body, but there are early data sets showing that a high-fat diet can indeed remove some of the plaque or blockage in the coronary artery. So we're eagerly looking to see more data on that. And then, of course, autoimmune diseases. There seems to be something about a high carbohydrate diet that activates autoimmune diseases. So by not having the carbohydrates in your diet, people seem to have better, in my case, arthritis, joint pain, and psoriasis, and some people use it for lupus and other diseases like that. So I've heard about people using it for mast cell disease as well, but I don't know that much about it. So most of what I've heard is just anecdotal. It's also known to help cure acne. I wish I'd known that. I had my parents both had acne when they were kids. I had it when I was a kid. They gave me all kinds of crazy drugs and creams and stuff. And I met people from other countries who's like, yeah, I don't remember kids having that when I was a kid, and it's kind of weird to come here and see so many kids with acne. And it probably was the diet. I mean, you can give kids all kinds of antibiotics and everything, and you're still not going to kill all those zits. So, anyways, hopefully a whole nother generation won't have to suffer with acne once more is known about the low carbohydrate, high fat, or ketogenic diets. Another advantage of the low carb, high fat diets, you keep your insulin down, which we talked about a lot in the previous videos. Also, leptin, which is a hormone or a chemical signal that's released in the body that says you're full or you're satisfied, you're not hungry, tends to be greater. That signal tends to be greater when you're on a high fat diet and a low carbohydrate diet. Conversely, you produce less ghrelin, and ghrelin is I try and remember, leptin and ghrelin are kind of the opposites of each other, and ghrelin kind of sounds like you're growling. So, well, when your stomach starts growling, that you can associate that with ghrelin, because ghrelin is the hunger hormone, as it were. It's the one that says, go eat more, you're getting hungry. So that's one of the things that people notice when they get on a ketogenic diet. They feel fuller faster, and they don't feel as hungry near as frequently, or they don't feel hunger to as much of an extent either. And you will wind up eating a lower volume of food on a ketogenic diet, and your stomach kind of shrinks. So it actually takes less to fill you up and cause that other signal, that you're full, which they call stomach distension. I believe it's the vagus nerve, and it kind of gets stretched out when your stomach's full, and it kind of helps. It's kind of sends signals to your brain saying, "Oh yeah, you can stop eating now because we're full." So that's another advantage. Overall caloric intake, um, the lower it is, the more it's associated with longevity. So there's this concept now that the fewer calories you take in, the longer you'll live. The more you sleep, the longer you'll live. Assuming you're not depriving yourself of sleep. I'm not saying you got to sleep all day, but you should be sleeping 7 to, probably 9 hours a night. So most of us don't do that, do we? But all of these lead to a longer life for a number of reasons. And that's another thing about fasting. When you're on a ketogenic diet and you're burning fat, it's very easy to fast. And you don't get these spikes in ghrelin and stuff like that. And you're obviously consuming a lot less calories. So you're potentially extending your life by taking in less fuel, less carbohydrate, less everything really. So you hear about these mouse studies where they starve the mice and they live a lot longer. Well, if you're on a ketogenic diet and you're used to burning fat, you just start burning your body fat, and it's not unpleasant like it is when you're on a high carbohydrate diet. So you don't feel like you're starving. So fasting is an entirely different experience when you're fat adapted, and so is sleeping. Ask just about everybody who's tried it. You sleep much deeper when you're fat adapted and on a ketogenic diet. So here's a staple for me, grass-fed butter. Like I've mentioned many times, it's tough to get enough fat in your diet because there isn't that much fat in our diets. The foods you buy, they typically tend to be short on fat because they've been taking the fat out of the food and replacing it with carbohydrates, because initially foods had more fats in them because people liked it, it tastes better, and then all these government guidelines come out and say, oh no, you're clogging your arteries, you're going to die. Take the fat out, and they replace fat with things like sugar typically. Another subject that comes up a lot in the books that have come out. So you can get grass-fed butter just about anywhere. I think almost every supermarket I've been in lately has it. You can buy it at Walmart. In fact, I think Walmart carries more than one brand in our area. So you can get the Kerry Gold. You can get this one here, which is local. Kerry Gold comes from Ireland. It's not available in states like Wisconsin, where butter has to be graded, because you can see here this is USDA approved grade A butter. So if it comes from Ireland, it's not graded. Therefore, it's against the law in some states. So don't get caught smuggling butter. Here's another great food. These are ribeyes. Yeah, the picture's a little skewed, so it's kind of hard to tell the ribeyes. But nice fatty grass-fed beef, a delight to eat, tender, juicy. I'll cook them. Lately, I've just been cooking them in a giant cast iron skillet in butter, grass-fed butter. And I put them in a glass container, take them to work and eat them. I don't even heat them up usually when I eat them. They're so tender. They just chew right into them. They're yummy. And then, of course, you can eat some fruit. You want to keep the sugar down. Blueberries are kind of a staple with a lot of keto people because they don't spike most people's blood sugar. But like anything, really, what you want to do is you want to eat a food like this, especially something suspect that has sugar in it, like a blueberry. Eat whatever, half a cup of them, and then wait 2 hours and test your blood sugar and see how high it goes up. So I try and do that with just about every food, because you never know which one is the one that's going to mess you up. Maybe none of them, but if you get down the road and you're not losing weight, or you hit a major plateau somewhere, you really need to start testing your food. So you eat that food in isolation by itself, then you test your blood. At the very least, you test it for your blood glucose levels and make sure they don't go up. a significant amount. And then if you do have a meter that tests ketones or beta hydroxybutyrate, you want to test that as well. Make sure your ketone levels are staying up. And of course, avocados are a staple. Easy to transport. This is one of those avocados with a giant pit in the middle, but it's a really tasty one. I'm trying to remember the name of it, but not necessarily the best deal for the dollar, but certainly one of the best tasting types of avocados. And it's a fruit. It's high in fat. I eat them all the time, and I eat them with plain. Make guacamole sometimes. Put homemade mayo on them. Put hot sauce on them. Salt, pepper, whatever. So, and they usually travel pretty good as long as they're not too soft. But once they get soft and mushy, the flavor's usually going out of them by then anyway. So buy them in small quantities, eat them when they're ripe, and just enjoy them because they're good for you. Entire populations at one time were sustained on them. So, what other kind of vegetable type stuff? I eat spinach, cauliflower, broccoli, kale, other leafy greens. Sometimes I buy greens and stuff at the store I've never had before. Then I can't even remember what they're called. So, don't be afraid to experiment. There's lots of, organic vegetables available now in most places. So it's getting downright competitive. Make sure you wash them. You might want to avoid things like romaine and even cilantro. We've been having a lot of problems with them having heavy bacteria loads and stuff like that. So, but that's up to you. I do eat lettuce and sometimes some cabbage. I will warn you, a lot of people eat a lot of raw vegetables, especially really coarse stuff like kale. They they get stomach problems because it's just a little too much roughage. So you should kind of at least lightly cook a lot of your vegetables. You could cook them in, bacon, fat, butter, a little olive oil. The saturated fats from animals are tougher and they hold up to heat better. That's another problem with a lot of the seed oils. They actually get damaged relatively quickly when you're cooking with them. They don't hold up to heat very well. Olive oil is a little better, but the saturated fats like lard and stuff like that hold up even better than that. So, but you're gonna notice that your digestion goes a little better. And to be honest with you, I'm thoroughly convinced you do not have to eat these foods. You think that if you stop eating foods full of fiber, you're going to just plug up and your digestive tract's going to crumple up on you or something. You're going to be constipated for the rest of your life. But I can tell you that's not true. There's lots of people that don't eat them anymore. The carnivore movement, there's lots and lots of people that just eat meat and drink water, and they're very healthy. And a lot of them are top tier athletes. So you look at the studies with people who are chronically constipated and they put them on a high fiber diet, and it's something like 23% of them experience some relief and the rest of them don't. So just ask anybody who's has problems with constipation, and ask them how helpful fiber is, and you'll find out pretty quickly if you ask enough people. It's not a very reliable resolution for the problem. And in some cases, adding fiber to the diet of somebody who's constipated is like adding rebar to concrete. So it can actually make it more difficult for them to have bowel movements. So I know we've just been brainwashed thinking that you had to have this high fiber diet and high fiber protected against all this and that. But if you don't eat a high carbohydrate diet, I don't think you really need much fiber, if any at all. But if you eat a high carbohydrate diet, well, you might as well pack in as much as you can. So things to avoid, definitely avoid grains. I know the food pyramid and all that was like built on grains. Eat your breads and your pastas and all that, but you know what? That's probably the biggest problem right there. Like wheat and corn by itself. And I used to eat a lot of quinoa or quinoa, depends on. Yeah, I always thought everybody called it quinoa, but there's plenty of people who call it quinoa, which actually makes more sense. So Don't write me any letters telling me I pronounced it wrong. And even rice. Oh, brown rice, good for you. Basmati rice, yeah, I don't know. I mean, like I said, countries like China, they don't have the obesity that like the United States has, but they have a worse problem with diabetes and pre-diabetes. And of course, don't eat anything sweet, that sugar or honey. I used to put honey in my coffee. Just a little honey in my coffee, a little half and half, but the milk and the half and half, the sugar and the honey, I'd have that, and then when I got hungry in the morning, I'd have an apple, and then I'd have a banana, and pretty soon my joints hurt so bad I could barely get out of the car when I got to work sometimes. So I'd get out of bed with being kind of sore, and by the time I got ready, went to work, got to work, I was in a lot of pain, and it was the carbohydrates, which just blew my mind because why the hell didn't my doctor say anything? Why didn't they say anything at the nutrition classes I went to my healthcare provider? They told me all the opposite. They told me, oh yeah, eat the grains, eat the quinoa, eat the rice, eat the brown rice, it's okay to eat some potatoes, and that stuff was just making me sicker and sicker. And I think that's the case for a lot of people. And it all comes down to just having too much sugar in your bloodstream, and then having too much insulin, and it just snowballs from there. So I basically already talked my way through this slide. Got ahead of myself again. But anyways, you see oats on here. I used to eat the steel cut oats, as slow cook those suckers, because they're supposedly healthier than the instant oats because they're less processed. I bought multigrain bread, but like I mentioned before, a slice of multigrain bread will actually spike your blood sugar just as fast as a spoonful of table sugar will, which is exactly what they said it wasn't going to do. They said, oh no, these multigrains break down at different rates, and then they don't spike your blood sugar. They slowly release the carbohydrates into your bloodstream. Well, it's just not true. Even the sprouted grain bread, I could whip out I could eat the bread, test my blood, and show you. So maybe for some people it works. Again, that goes back to things being individualized. Same thing with potatoes. If I ever figure out the trick to the resistant starch, which someday I may just try the starch diet, but I think it's potatoes that have been cooked more than one time. It converts the starch into a resistant state. Or I bought some potato starch that was already processed like that. But I think there's green bananas, plantains, and a few other things you can get resistant starch from that does not absorb into your bloodstream as a carbohydrate or a sugar. So something to look forward to in the future. I'm gonna conquer that one day too. Here's some examples of foods I do eat. The last video I started talking more about foods that I do eat. These are fatty foods. So heavy whipping cream, I'm a big fan. Put a little of that in your coffee, or if you're trying to get into ketosis and get revved up, my buddy Aaron passed this little trick on to me. He would just drink a glass of heavy whipping cream, and I'll tell you, it tastes good. It's like drinking ice cream or something. And when you don't eat carbohydrates anymore, it actually kind of tastes sweet to you, even though there's really not that much lactose in it, because a lot of heavy whipping creams are 30-40% fat, and there's not a lot of milk in there. So one of these days I'll post the nutritional facts. We can look at them and talk about them. And the other one is coconut oil here. Coconut oil is relatively new to me. I haven't been eating it that long, but it's another fat you can cook with as well. All your cooking you want to do at the lowest possible temperatures, because one, everything breaks down, including your fats that you're trying to cook with, and two, as the higher the heat and the more heat there is, the more likely you are to generate carcinogens. So, try not to overcook your food. I know I came from a family that ate things on the rare side, so I'm used to it, but I know a lot of people are used to like burnt meat, which to me is just repulsive, and I kind of feel sorry for people who eat that way. But for some reason, they think if they don't, that all started with people thinking they had to be cooked. maybe because it was going to spoil. And I know some people came from countries where food was hard to get and the meat wasn't fresh, and they had to cook it real good to make sure they didn't get sick. But guess what? You can get better quality meat now. And there's no food without risk, you know. Just go to the FDA website and look at all the food recalls. It's bread, it's lettuce, it's meat, it's all kinds of stuff. Even kratom supplements, you know, they're contaminated with all kinds of stuff. So just go feast your eyes on that. Here's some sour cream. I guess I assumed everybody know that's a container of sour cream, but you can see the nutritional facts there. It's only 5 grams per serving, but it has, you know, only 1 gram of protein, which is something you run into, is that a lot of even fatty foods have high protein contents, and it's hard to get the fat level or the fat ratio up higher. But this food, you know, sour cream tastes good with a lot of things, and this one here is 1 gram of protein, 1 gram of carbohydrate, and 5 grams of fat per serving. So I know sometimes it's confusing to people what these numbers mean, but the first thing to look for is, number one, how much fat does it have? How much protein does it have, and how many carbohydrates? And they'll be listed in different orders, but you should be able to see them right here in the picture. And then the percentage daily value, just ignore that, because it's just, you know, a recommendation that's pretty much irrelevant. So just ignore that percentage thing over there. It's usually on the right side of the label, and just kind of read the left side of the label. Always read your labels. This here is kind of a rock star in the ketogenic world and a lot of dietary regimes. This is actually made from coconut oil. It's a MCT oil. It's MCT stands for medium chain triglyceride. So it's a triglyceride, which sounds scary because you don't want to have high triglycerides in your bloodstream, but as a food supplement, it rocks. It's a liquid. It's an oil. Be careful with it when you're new to it, because more than a half a tablespoon and you might have what is sometimes referred to as disaster pants, or, you know, diarrhea. I've never had any sort of uncontrollable diarrhea from it, but you know, I usually eat it in small quantities. I'll mix it into a bulletproof coffee with butter and heavy whipping cream or something like that, and I'll mix it into scrambled eggs, which is a little tip I got from my friend Aaron and his wife. You mix some MCT oil with some heavy whipping cream with your nice organic cage-free eggs, and makes it from nice, creamy, fluffy eggs. You'll love them. They aren't dry, you know, they don't get all dry when you're trying to cook them. Because I know most people, you know, they're worried about undercooking eggs because they don't want to get salmonella or something. Of course, you can find all kinds of people that eat raw eggs all the time. I make, you know, mayo with raw egg all the time. I have it in the fridge for a week or 2 weeks if I don't get it in I have no worries. That's another thing. When you're healthy, you have strong stomach acid. Strong stomach acid is like the first gateway. It destroys bacteria, viruses, parasites, the whole 9 yards. That's how our ancestors made it in a wild world, you know. So I touched on bulletproof coffee. I personally drink coffee. Most people do. Some people have problems if they don't give it up. Same thing with tea. Everybody thinks tea is great and benign, and there are a lot of good teas out there, but truth is it can create problems for people, and it's an individual thing. And then bone broth. Bone broth is something you know, it's basically just salty water with bones cooked in it. You can put other seasonings in it. When I'm fasting, I make it and I skim all the fat off, and then I'm just trying to absorb all the nutrients that I might be lacking in, or that might not get absorbed when I'm eating a regular diet. So, and I fast, an intermittent fast for me is, 12 to 16 hours, but an extended fast is usually 2 to 10 days. And I've done it with just water and coffee and tea, and I've done it with water, coffee, tea, and bone broth. And I usually take vitamins, usually take some magnesium or something, maybe some potassium, and definitely some salt, some sodium. So I'm going to start adding links to the show notes. So the little description at the bottom there in text, I'm going to start adding that information so people can read more about these topics on their own. And again, I have to keep asking, please hit the subscribe button. Let me know if there's any topics that you want to hear. I've got a long list of stuff that I'm planning on covering. I hope you enjoyed this podcast, and I hope it helps somebody out there. And this is the end. I put a slide in here that says it's the end, so I know when to stop talking. And I don't click into a blank page. So anyways, thanks again for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you watch the next one.